mother of twins returns, 4 years later, surprising Millionaire CEO and revealing he's their father. Hello and welcome, beautiful souls. Thank you so much for joining me on this incredible journey of love, pain, redemption, and second chances. This story isn't just about two people coming together. It's about the power of forgiveness, the strength to rise above our pasts, and the healing that only love can bring. I'm so glad you're here with me today, witnessing this powerful journey unfold. I truly hope you've been touched by every twist, turn, and emotion of this story. The best part? It's just the beginning of something even greater. If you've enjoyed every moment so far, don't go anywhere because this story has more to offer. Trust me, you're going to want to stick around until the very end. Nalani's desk was cluttered with papers, pens, and a half-finished cup of coffee that had gone cold hours ago. The fluorescent lights above buzzed in the silent office, their stark glow illuminating the quiet hum of the city beyond the windows. Despite the early hour, the building was already bustling with people in suits, running between meetings, making calls, and ensuring the machinery of corporate life moved without pause. For Nalani, this was just another day in a routine she had grown accustomed to, where deadlines, phone calls, and emails became second nature. She was a woman of precision and focus, with an innate grace that made her stand out even in a room full of people. Her dark braided hair framed her face in perfect symmetry, and her brown eyes, though soft, held a certain sharpness. Nalani had always been different from the others, observant, intelligent, and unafraid to challenge the status quo when needed. But in this corporate world, standing out too much was risky, and so she remained in the shadows, doing her work quietly, never demanding attention. Her job as Lucien Vale's personal secretary was not something she had initially aspired to, but it was a stable position in a prestigious company, and it provided her with the financial security she had needed after finishing her degree. Lucien Vale, the CEO of the company, was a man who needed little introduction. His reputation preceded him, ruthless, calculating, and a master of business manipulation. His icy blue eyes were often the last thing people saw before they realized they had just been played. Despite his success, he had a reputation for being cold and distant, showing little regard for others unless they could serve his purpose. Lucien had always kept a safe distance from Nalani, seeing her as just another employee in the sea of faces that came and went from his office. She was smart, capable, and reliable, but in his world that was nothing extraordinary. He had always kept his flirtations reserved for the younger, more glamorous women in the office, those who fit his idea of beauty, blonde, tall, and conventionally perfect. But this time something was different. One fateful morning, as Nalani walked into the office to begin her workday, Lucian's eyes lingered on her as she passed by his desk. She didn't notice, absorbed in her own thoughts, her mind already organizing her tasks for the day. But he watched her, something stirring in him that had never been there before. Maybe it was the way the sunlight filtered through the window, casting a warm glow on her face, or the quiet confidence in the way she carried herself. Whatever it was, it made him see her in a new light. For the next few days, Lucien began to look for excuses to be near her. It started with casual conversations, small talk that at first seemed insignificant. He would compliment her on her efficiency, her organizational skills, and her ability to handle the chaos of the office with such poise. Nalani, ever professional, responded with polite smiles, but kept the conversation strictly business. She knew better than to indulge in the flirtations of her boss, especially one as powerful and unpredictable as Lucien Vale. But Lucien wasn't used to being ignored, and something about Nalani's cool demeanor intrigued him. She wasn't like the others. She didn't fawn over him or laugh at his jokes just to gain favor. She didn't seem impressed by his wealth or status, which only made him more determined to break down the walls she had carefully constructed around herself. One afternoon, Lucien called her into his office. "Nalani," he began, his voice smooth and authoritative, "I need your help with something. I've been reviewing some files, and I need your keen eye on them." Nalani nodded and stepped into his office, taking a seat across from his massive desk. She opened the file in front of her, but she could feel Lucien's gaze on her the entire time. The way he studied her made her uncomfortable. It was different than before, less businesslike, more personal. "I've been thinking," Lucien continued, his voice softer now, almost contemplative. "You're one of the few people here who seems unaffected by everything that goes on. You have this calm about you. It's rare." Nalani's eyes flicked up to meet his, but she quickly looked away. She didn't trust his words. "Thank you, Mr. Vale," she said, keeping her tone neutral. "I try to keep my focus on the work." Lucien leaned back in his chair, folding his arms across his chest. "I admire that," he said. "But there's more to life than work, don't you think?" Nalani's mind raced as she tried to process his words. She knew the game Lucien was playing. He was trying to get under her skin, trying to see how much he could manipulate her. She had seen it countless times before, his charm, his charisma, his way of getting people to do what he wanted. But there was something about the way he looked at her now, something different. His usual arrogance was still there, but beneath it there was a hint of something softer, almost vulnerable. "I'm not interested in distractions, Mr. Vale," Nalani replied, her voice steady. "I have enough to focus on." Lucien's lips curled into a smile, but it was different from the usual smirk that accompanied his words. There was a sincerity to it, a glimmer of something genuine. "Fair enough," he said, "but don't be too quick to dismiss what life has to offer." For the rest of the day, Nalani couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. Lucien's words, though simple, had stirred something in her, but she quickly shut the thought down. She wasn't going to fall for his games. Not this time. The next week, Lucien's advances became more obvious. He started to leave little notes on her desk, telling her how he admired her work ethic, how he appreciated her intelligence. At first, Nalani brushed it off, thinking it was just his way of being charming. But then, one evening, Lucien approached her as she was about to leave for the day. "Nalani," he said softly, his voice low, "I'd like to take you out to dinner. Just the two of us. No work, no distractions. I think you and I could have a good time." Nalani hesitated, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew what he was offering. It wasn't just dinner. It was a test of her willpower, of her ability to resist the charm of a man like him. "I'm not sure that's a good idea, Mr. Vale," she replied, trying to maintain her professional distance. Lucien's eyes darkened with a hint of frustration, but he quickly masked it with a smile. "Come on, Nalani. What's the harm? We could have a conversation. You might even find me interesting." Nalani was silent for a moment, her mind racing. She had heard the stories, the women who had fallen for Lucien's charms, only to be discarded once he grew bored. But there was something in his eyes now, something she couldn't quite place. Maybe it was the vulnerability he was hiding beneath that hard exterior, or maybe it was just the undeniable attraction that she could no longer ignore. "All right," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "But just dinner. No strings attached." Lucien's face lit up with a smile that seemed to light up the whole room. "You won't regret it," he promised. And as Nalani walked away, she couldn't help but wonder if, just this once, she might have just made a mistake. The week after Lucien's proposition, Nalani found herself standing in front of the mirror in her small apartment, eyeing the dress she had picked out for their dinner. She had tried to dismiss his invitation, to tell herself that nothing would come of it, but something about his persistence gnawed at her. She had told herself she would resist, that she wouldn't be like the others who fell for his charm. She had a solid reputation to protect, a life built on independence and self-respect. But with every passing day, those walls she had carefully constructed around herself began to crumble. Lucian's persistence wasn't like anything she had experienced before. It wasn't just the occasional flirtatious glance or a sly comment here and there. It was the way he made her feel like she was the center of his world, at least for that moment. Every time she entered the office, there was a note waiting for her on her desk, always handwritten, always filled with a sweetness that felt too real to be just another part of his game. I've been thinking about you, Nalani. You have a rare grace, and I find myself wanting to know more about you. The notes, the unexpected phone calls in the late hours of the night, all of it chipped away at her resolve. His attention was like a slow-burning fire that spread warmth through her chest, despite all her efforts to keep it at bay. There was no denying the chemistry between them, and, perhaps more dangerously, there was a part of her that was curious. Maybe she could just take one step closer. Maybe it would just be dinner, one night of indulgence, and she would walk away untouched. But deep down, she knew that wouldn't be the case. Lucien wasn't the type to settle for anything less than complete control, and she had seen enough of the way he manipulated the world around him. But that night, despite her warnings, Nalani found herself standing in front of her mirror, adjusting her dress. She couldn't help but be drawn in. She arrived at the upscale restaurant, feeling a wave of nervous energy wash over her. Lucien had booked an intimate corner table, hidden away from the bustle of the restaurant. As she stepped inside, the scent of expensive wine and freshly prepared dishes surrounded her. The soft glow of candlelight reflected off the polished silverware, and everything seemed carefully curated to set the mood, a mood that seemed all too intentional. Lucien was already there, sitting with an air of casual elegance, his sharp suit contrasting against the dimmed lighting. He stood up the moment she walked in, his eyes lighting up with that unmistakable glint that made her heart flutter despite her better judgment. "Nalani," he said, his voice rich with warmth and admiration. "You look stunning." Her heart skipped a beat as she met his gaze, trying to keep her cool. She wasn't here to fall into his web, but she couldn't deny the pull between them. His charm was too potent, too intoxicating. "Thank you," she replied, her voice steady but her breath betraying her. They sat down and quickly fell into conversation, light-hearted banter at first, about their work, their interests, and the strange ways life had led them to this table. The distance between them, the professional distance she had clung to for so long, was slowly eroded with each passing second. At one point during the meal, Lucien reached across the table to gently brush a strand of hair from her face. It was an innocent gesture, but something about it stirred her, and her pulse quickened. His touch lingered for just a fraction of a second longer than necessary, and Nalani's breath caught in her throat. She looked away, suddenly unsure of herself. But Lucien didn't let the moment pass. "I've been thinking about something," he said, his voice now softer, almost vulnerable. "I know I've been persistent and I don't want you to feel pressured, but there's something about you that I can't quite place. It's like I've been waiting for you, without even realizing it." Nalani's heart skipped a beat. He didn't even try to hide the intensity in his eyes. This wasn't just flattery. There was a depth to his words, a sincerity that she hadn't expected from him. "I'm not sure what you mean," Nalani said quietly, her voice betraying a hint of uncertainty. Lucien leaned back in his chair, his gaze never leaving her. "Maybe I'm just tired of the games, tired of the people who pretend to be something they're not. You're real, and that's rare, especially in this world." His words were like a balm to a wound she didn't realize she had. She had been surrounded by artifice her entire life, at school, in the office, even in the people she called friends. His honesty, though unexpected, touched something deep inside her. As the evening continued, the walls she had so carefully built around herself continued to fall. They talked about their childhoods, their dreams, the parts of themselves that no one ever saw. Lucian's charm was like a steady stream, pulling her deeper into the current with every word, every gesture. By the time dinner came to an end, the city lights outside the window had begun to twinkle, and the night had settled into a quiet rhythm. Nalani stood to leave, but Lucian stopped her with a gentle hand on her arm. "You know, it's a beautiful night," he said softly. "Why don't we take a walk? The city looks different at night." Something inside her told her to leave, to walk away before she made a mistake, but instead she found herself nodding. "All right, just a short walk." They stepped out into the cool evening air, the lights of the city casting long shadows on the streets. As they walked side by side, the distance between them seemed to shrink, the warmth of his presence becoming impossible to ignore. She had to remind herself that she couldn't let this happen. Not like this. Not now. But as they strolled, Lucian's hand brushed against hers. A simple touch. But it ignited something inside her, and she couldn't help herself. She didn't pull away. Instead, she allowed her hand to linger in his, just for a moment. Without warning, he turned to face her, his face inches from hers. His eyes were intense, his breath warm on her skin. "I can't stop thinking about you, Nalani," he whispered, his voice low and filled with an emotion she couldn't name. Before she could respond, he leaned in, his lips capturing hers in a kiss that was both gentle and demanding. Her heart raced, and for a moment she forgot about the warnings she had given herself. The kiss deepened, and time seemed to stretch out around them. It was a moment of surrender, a moment where nothing mattered except the feeling of his lips on hers. When they finally broke apart, they stood there for a moment, breathing heavily, the air between them charged with unspoken desire. "I never thought it would be like this," Nalani murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. Lucian's eyes softened and he cupped her face in his hands. "Neither did I," he said, his voice raw with emotion. "But I can't stay away from you." And just like that, the game had begun. The days that followed their stolen kiss under the city lights felt like a blur of excitement and uncertainty. Lucian's persistence had shifted from casual flirtation to something far deeper, more consuming. Their meetings became more frequent, more intimate. He no longer hid his desire for her behind corporate conversations or formal meetings. Now it was all about stolen moments, shared whispers, and lingering touches. But Nalani couldn't fully give herself over to this romance. No matter how hard she tried to push the nagging voice in her mind aside, it continued to echo louder each day. "You don't belong here." She couldn't ignore the world Lucian came from, the world of privilege, where connections ran deeper than bloodlines, where people who looked like her were little more than strangers, to be dismissed and overlooked. She had spent years fighting for respect in spaces where she was always made to feel like an outsider. Lucien's world was a world of glistening power and flawless facades, a place where her skin color and background would forever be a barrier. He, with his icy blue eyes, flawless jawline, and effortless charm, could never truly understand the struggles she had faced. She knew all the rumors, the women he'd gone through, the hearts he had shattered without a second thought. Lucien Vale was not a man to be tamed, not someone who would tie himself down to one person for long. He was a man who lived to conquer, to build and destroy at will, and in the back of her mind she feared she was no different from the others, a fleeting chapter in his life that would one day be torn from the pages. But even with the weight of that uncertainty hanging over her, there was something in the way he looked at her that made her feel different, special. He was different with her. "You're different," he whispered to her one night as they sat together on the roof of one of the city's most exclusive penthouses. The moonlight bathed the world around them in a silvery glow, and the city sprawled beneath them like a sea of twinkling stars. Lucian had taken her to a rooftop restaurant where they had dined under the stars, and after the meal he had led her up to a private space he had arranged, just the two of them, high above the chaos of the city. Nalani, though skeptical and wary, couldn't help but smile. He had a way of making her feel like she was the only person in the world that mattered at that moment. "You've said that before," she replied, her voice soft but tinged with doubt. "I don't understand, Lucien. I'm not like them. You live in a world I can't even imagine." Lucien's eyes softened, and for a moment, the usual arrogance and controlled demeanor that surrounded him seemed to slip away. His fingers brushed lightly against hers as he leaned closer, his breath warm in the cool evening air. "You are different," he said, his voice steady, as though each word held a weight of conviction. "I don't know what it is about you, Nalani, but you're not like the others. You see through all the bullshit, and that's rare. You don't play games. You're real." Her heart tightened in her chest at the sincerity in his eyes. She had heard men say things like that before, but with Lucien it felt different. His words had weight. They weren't just flattery or empty compliments. For the first time, Nalani found herself questioning everything she had believed about herself, about him, and about what was possible between them. She had always believed that the gap between their worlds, between his wealth and status and her life as a hard-working, self-made woman, was insurmountable. But here, on this rooftop, she felt like she could believe in the impossible. She could almost imagine a future where she wasn't just a passing moment in his life, where they could have something real. Their dates grew more tender after that night. Lucien surprised her with picnics on hidden rooftops, where they shared sandwiches and laughter under the sun, far from the eyes of the world that expected them to be something else. On weekends, they danced in empty clubs, the music playing softly around them, the strobe lights flashing in sync with their heartbeats. Sometimes he would drive her around the city in the late hours of the night, the world asleep around them, their conversations quiet and intimate, as though they were the only two people alive. He made her feel seen, made her feel like she was enough. In those moments, it didn't matter that he came from a world of privilege, or that she had fought tooth and nail to get where she was. In his arms, all of that seemed trivial, as though their differences didn't matter. And slowly, imperceptibly, Nalani began to let her guard down. The doubts that had once dominated her thoughts now felt distant, like shadows on the edges of her mind. She imagined what it would be like to spend a lifetime with someone who cared for her in the way Lucien seemed to. Could this be real? Could they have a forever, despite everything? But there were still nights when doubt crept in, when the shadows of reality stretched across her mind. There were moments when Lucien would say something, or they would be out in public together, and she would catch the way people looked at them. Her, the black woman by his side, in a world where that pairing was rarely accepted without judgment. She saw the way some of his friends looked at her with thinly veiled disdain, their glances filled with pity or, worse, judgment. She heard the whispers behind her back at parties and gatherings, the subtle slights that no one dared to say out loud. Yet Lucien never seemed to notice. He never saw those stares, those sideways glances, and maybe, just maybe, he didn't care. His world was one of superficiality and status, but when he looked at her, she could see that he saw something more. "You're different, Nalani," he would say over and over again. "You're mine." Those words wrapped around her like a blanket, soothing the sharp edges of her fears, but deep down a voice whispered at the back of her mind, "What if this is just a game for him too?" But tonight, as they danced in the darkened club, their bodies pressed together in perfect rhythm, Nalani couldn't help but push the doubts aside for just a moment. She was caught in the magic of the moment, feeling his arms around her, the way his hands held her like he was never going to let go. For the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to imagine something more, to imagine that there could be a forever with Lucien Vale. Nalani sat in the bathroom of her small apartment, her hands trembling as she clutched the pregnancy test. The words on the small screen were undeniable. Pregnant. Her heart pounded in her chest, and for a moment the world seemed to freeze. She stared at the result, her mind racing with a storm of emotions. Twins. The thought flooded her mind, overwhelming her with a mix of joy, disbelief, and fear. The twins were a testament to everything that had grown between her and Lucien, to the undeniable connection they shared. It was real. It wasn't a fleeting affair or a passing moment of passion. No, this was something deeper. This was the physical manifestation of their love. A soft smile tugged at the corners of her lips, and she closed her eyes for a moment, letting the joy of the revelation wash over her. She had imagined this moment 1,000 times, but never like this, never with the uncertainty that clouded her future. She couldn't help but picture Lucien's reaction, how his eyes would light up, how he would smile, how they would build their family together. With trembling hands, she reached for her phone, her heart soaring as she dialed his number. She had never felt more certain of anything in her life. This was it, the moment everything would change. "Lucien," she whispered when he answered, her voice thick with emotion. "I need to tell you something. I'm pregnant. We're having twins." Her breath caught in her throat as she waited for his response, imagining the joy in his voice, the excitement. She could already picture him running his hands through his hair in that familiar, charming way of his, smiling with excitement. But there was nothing. A suffocating silence filled the line, a silence that stretched on longer than she could bear. Her heart began to race, the pounding in her chest drowning out all other sounds. Her mind screamed that this couldn't be happening. This was supposed to be the moment of happiness, the moment they shared their dreams together. "Lucien," she asked, her voice now shaking, "are you there?" Still, no response. A knot formed in her stomach, and panic began to claw at her throat. She held the phone to her ear, listening intently, waiting for a sign of life on the other end, but it never came. Her fingers tightened around the phone, her knuckles pale as she tried to hold back the surge of emotions threatening to overtake her. Then, just as the silence began to feel unbearable, the call disconnected. Nalani stared at the screen, the cold blue of her phone glaring back at her. She pressed the redial button over and over, but each time the same result, a voice message telling her that the number was no longer available. He had blocked her. The world seemed to tilt beneath her feet. The weight of the revelation crashed over her, and she stumbled back against the bathroom wall, sinking to the floor. Her breath came in shallow gasps as her mind raced, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Why? The question echoed through her mind, the hurt in her chest consuming her. She couldn't understand it. The warmth they had shared, the laughter, the closeness. They had been building something, hadn't they? Or had she just been a fool, blind to the truth? Was she nothing more than another name in a long list of women who had fallen for his charm and his promises, only to be discarded when the reality of responsibility set in? Her tears fell silently, one after another, as she sat there in the quiet bathroom, her hand resting protectively over her stomach. She was no longer just a young woman who had been swept up in a whirlwind romance. Now she was a mother, carrying two lives inside of her. And Lucien, the man who had promised her the world, had disappeared without a trace, leaving her to face this reality alone. For a long time she sat there in the darkness, her emotions a tangled mess of confusion, hurt, and fear. The loneliness settled in deep, the quiet of the apartment echoing with the absence of the one person she had hoped would share this journey with her. But as the hours passed and the tears dried, something inside Nalani began to shift. She was no longer just a victim of heartbreak. She was a woman carrying the lives of two children, and she would protect them. She would do whatever it took to make sure they had a better life than the one she had lived, better than the one she had imagined with Lucien. The world had just turned upside down, But Nalani wasn't about to let it break her. She would rise, stronger than before, for her twins, for herself, and for everything that was yet to come. And so, as the days passed, she gathered the pieces of her shattered heart, putting them back together as best she could. There was no going back to the life she had known before Lucien had walked into it. But there was a new purpose now, a new drive that burned bright within her. She would never forget Lucien's betrayal, the way he had blocked her out of his life without a second thought, leaving her alone with the weight of their future on her shoulders. But she would also never let that pain define her. She would make a life for her twins. She would show them the strength of a mother's love, the resilience that came with surviving a broken heart. And she would never, ever let anyone take that from her. The streets were colder than Nalani had ever imagined. With each passing day, her once vibrant spirit seemed to wither beneath the weight of her heartbreak, the harshness of reality biting deeper with every step she took. When Lucien had vanished from her life, he took more than just her trust. He took the very foundation she had built her life upon. All she had left now was the child, or children, growing within her, the heartbeat of the future she had to protect. The first night on the streets had been the hardest. Nalani had always prided herself on her independence, her ability to stand tall no matter what life threw her way. But now she found herself alone in a way she'd never imagined. She had no home to return to, no safe haven where she could rest her head and close her eyes in peace. The apartment she had, once called her own, had been sold, the money from her last paycheck spent on food and small comforts to tide her over before the inevitable collapse of everything she thought she knew. She had no choice but to rely on shelters, places that smelled of mildew and desperation, where the walls felt as though they were closing in on her. But even in the darkness of those shelters, Nalani refused to give in to despair. She held her belly close, protecting the growing life inside her. And though the world around her seemed cold and indifferent, she told herself every day that she could still rise above it all. Her twins needed her strength. They needed her to be the mother she had always hoped to be. The months passed, and as her pregnancy progressed, so did the harshness of her circumstances. The more visible her belly became, the crueler the stares. Some people gave her pitying glances, as if she were a burden on society, a woman who had fallen into the cracks of the world. Others were less kind, mocking her for what they perceived as a careless mistake. A woman who had been too trusting of a man who never intended to stay. She heard the whispers, the cruel words thrown her way as she walked through the streets, just another face in the crowd of the forgotten. There were days when the exhaustion almost overtook her. Days when her body screamed for rest, when the pain in her back and legs made every step feel like an insurmountable challenge. But Nalani didn't have the luxury of surrendering to the ache. There was work to be done, small jobs here and there, tasks that paid just enough to keep her fed. She sewed clothes by hand, patches on torn garments, tailoring for the few who offered her the chance to work. It wasn't much, but it kept her going. She couldn't afford to think about the life she had lost, the dreams that had shattered. All she could do was focus on surviving, on getting through one day at a time. There were nights when hunger gnawed at her insides, when she lay on the cold concrete, listening to the sounds of the city around her, honking horns, distant voices, the hum of life continuing on without her. But she had to keep moving. She had no other choice. But even in the darkest of times, there were moments of grace. There were times when a stranger would offer her a warm meal, a smile, a few coins in her hand. The kindness was rare, but it was there, and it kept her going. Each small act of kindness reminded her that the world was not entirely devoid of compassion, that there was still light in the midst of the overwhelming darkness. As the months passed, Nalani's belly grew, and with it, her resolve. She knew she wasn't alone, not really. Her twins were with her, their tiny hearts beating inside her. She would never let them know what it was like to feel abandoned, to be unloved. No matter how hard life became, she would make sure they knew they were wanted, that they were her reason for breathing. The day came, as it always does, when the pain of childbirth overtook her. She had been in and out of the charity-run clinics, gathering what little support she could, and though the clinic was small and simple, it offered her a place of refuge. Nalani had no family to help her, no one to lean on, but the nurses at the clinic were kind. They helped her through the pain, offered her words of encouragement when she wanted to give up, and held her hand when she needed strength. The moment of her twins' birth was nothing short of miraculous, a raw, painful, beautiful culmination of everything she had endured. The cries of her sons filled the room as they were born, and in those moments, everything else faded away. The pain, the heartache, the loneliness, all of it melted into the background as Nalani held her boys for the first time. They were perfect, they were beautiful, and they were hers. As she gazed down at them, tears welling in her eyes, she whispered their names, names she had chosen long before she had known who they would be, long before she knew how the world would treat them. Courage, she whispered to the first, a strong, bold name that reminded her of the fight she had carried every day of her life. He would need courage to face the world, just as she had. And to the second, Truth, a name that spoke to the deep honesty she had found within herself. He would need truth to survive in a world full of lies, deceit, and pretense. Courage and truth. They were the embodiment of everything Nalani had left in her. They were her reason for surviving, her purpose, her future. In that moment, the streets that had once felt like a cold, unforgiving place no longer mattered. The cruel stares, the abandonment, those were things of the past. Nalani had her children now, and nothing else in the world mattered more. She would raise them on her terms. She would teach them the lessons of resilience, of love, and of fighting for what was right. There was no more room for doubt. The road ahead would be difficult, but she had already walked through the worst of it. She had survived, and she would continue to survive for them, for courage, for truth. While Nalani slept in shelters, huddled beneath threadbare blankets, Lucien was living a life few could imagine. His days were a blur of extravagant parties, elite gatherings, and late-night celebrations on private yachts, floating in the crystal-clear waters of the Mediterranean. In the opulent penthouses of Paris, the glamorous rooftops of Milan, and the luxurious villas of Monaco, Lucien was a king. Untouchable, admired, and untouched by the reality that had crushed Nalani. He was the man of the moment, the one who had it all, power, money, and a world of beautiful people eager to share his company. He moved effortlessly between city after city, surrounded by models draped in designer gowns, socialites in glittering diamonds, and business tycoons who treated him as an equal. The nights were always filled with champagne, laughter, and the constant hum of the elite, who were always looking for the next thrill. Lucien had perfected the art of living without consequence. He surrounded himself with fleeting pleasures and disposable relationships, and in his mind the past was something that had been sealed away long ago. There were no lingering thoughts of Nalani, no second-guessing or doubts. She had been nothing more than a brief distraction, a chapter in his life he had quickly closed. He had blocked her number, deleted the messages, and buried the memory of her beneath the weight of his success and indulgence. She had been foolish to think that he would stay, that their brief moments together would mean more than they had. In Lucien's world, there was always another beautiful woman, another night of decadence waiting for him. But as with all things, even the most captivating distractions can lose their allure. Lucien's life, though full of luxury and excitement, was beginning to feel hollow. He'd experienced every pleasure, met every person of consequence, and yet something was missing. He couldn't pinpoint it. There was no specific moment when the emptiness crept in. But it was there. Something about the frenetic energy of his lifestyle had started to wear him down. Then, one evening, during a lavish gala at an exclusive resort in the south of France, he met Ilara. Ilara Caruso was a vision, a stunning heiress, a woman whose beauty was almost otherworldly. She had the kind of elegance that turned heads effortlessly, the kind of grace that commanded attention without her even trying. Her dark eyes sparkled with intelligence, her laughter was melodic, and she carried herself with a quiet confidence that fascinated Lucien. In a crowd full of beautiful women, Ilara stood out like a diamond among stones. She was not a mere socialite. She was an heiress to a vast fortune, with ties to some of Europe's oldest and most influential families. To Lucien, she was more than just an attractive woman. She was an opportunity, a stepping stone to a new chapter. Her family's wealth and influence were exactly the kind of connections he needed to solidify his place among the global elite. Their first conversation was electric. It was a dance of words, playful and flirtatious, but there was something deeper in the way they exchanged glances, the way Alara seemed to challenge him in a way no one else ever had. She wasn't like the others. She wasn't dazzled by his money or status. She had her own. And for the first time in years, Lucien felt truly intrigued by someone. What followed was a whirlwind romance. Their nights were filled with whispered conversations in private villas, private jets whisking them away to remote islands, and champagne that flowed freely as the world around them disappeared. They were the perfect couple, the one everyone envied. Together, they were unstoppable. Lucien had found someone who matched him in every way, someone who understood the world he lived in, someone who could take the place of all the fleeting pleasures that had once defined his existence. Ilara was ambitious, beautiful, and had a presence that could not be ignored. She was the woman who could bring him the respect and admiration he craved, and in turn, he could give her everything she desired. It wasn't long before Lucien made the decision that would change everything. He would marry her. The announcement came one sunny morning, splashed across the headlines of every major media outlet. Lucien Vale, the city's most eligible bachelor, to wed heiress Ilara Caruso. The news spread like wildfire, causing a ripple through the circles Lucien had once dominated. His name was everywhere, in the tabloids, on television, on the lips of socialites and business magnates alike. The media buzzed with excitement, photographers hounding the couple at every turn, eager to catch a glimpse of the perfect pair. For Lucien, the announcement was not just about Ilara. It was a statement. It was about reclaiming the image he had so carefully constructed, a world where he was untouchable, where nothing and no one could stand in the way of his success. Ilara, with her beauty, her wealth, and her connections, was the ideal partner in that vision. She was everything he had ever wanted, a reflection of his power, a symbol of his rise. But in the back of his mind, there was a flicker of something else, something he couldn't quite shake. It was an echo from the past, a face he couldn't forget, the fleeting image of a woman he had once known, a woman who had once believed in him, who had trusted him with her love. He tried to push it away, tried to convince himself it was just a shadow of guilt, nothing more. But as he sat in his luxury penthouse, the golden rays of the sun casting a soft glow over the city below, he felt a strange unease. His thoughts drifted, unbidden, to the memory of Nalani, to the woman whose heart he had shattered with the coldest indifference. Had she forgiven him? Was she still out there, struggling alone, carrying the weight of their past? But the moment passed. He pushed it aside, drowned it out with thoughts of the future, with Ilara by his side. After all, that was what mattered now, wasn't it? He glanced at the engagement ring gleaming on Ilara's finger, and pushed the thought of Nalani back into the farthest corner of his mind. The past was buried, and Lucien was ready to step into the future he had always envisioned for himself. One filled with luxury, wealth, and the kind of life most could only dream of. But little did he know, the past was far from forgotten, and soon the consequences of his actions would come crashing down on him in ways he could never have imagined. The morning had come too quickly. Nalani had barely slept the night before, the strain of caring for her twins taking its toll. She had spent another long night in the cramped apartment she had managed to rent after months of hardship, surrounded by the soft cooing of courage and truth as they slept soundly in the corner. She had found small, inexpensive furniture at thrift stores, items that were worn and used, but made their space feel like a home, a refuge where the boys could grow and feel safe. Despite everything, there were moments of peace. She was determined to give her children the love and security that they deserved, no matter how hard life had been. She had learned to make do with what little she had, holding on to hope through the quiet moments, when she fed her boys, when she watched them sleep, when they gripped her fingers with their tiny hands. They were her world. As Nalani sat on the couch, feeding courage with one hand, while truth lay on her lap, the other hand absent-mindedly reached for her phone. She had stopped checking the news regularly, preferring to keep her focus on her children rather than the outside world. But today, something compelled her to scroll through her social media feed. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe it was just the flicker of a memory that still lingered in the back of her mind, but she couldn't resist. It was then that she saw it. Lucien Vale, the city's most eligible bachelor, to wed heiress Elara Caruso. Her breath caught in her throat as she stared at the headline, her hand trembling slightly, the phone almost slipping from her grip. The words blurred for a moment, as if the weight of them had forced the world to pause. Lucien, her Lucien, the man who had promised her the moon and stars, was marrying another woman, and not just any woman. Elara Caruso, the heiress of a fortune larger than Nalani could ever fathom. The very woman he had turned to when he left her to fend for herself, alone and heartbroken. Anger surged through Nalani's veins like wildfire. She didn't just feel betrayed for herself, she felt the betrayal for her sons, for courage and truth. They would grow up in a world where their father would never know them, where he would never see their faces, never hold them in his arms. She felt the deep ache of their absence as though it were a wound she could not heal. As her heart hammered in her chest, she looked down at her sons, at their innocent faces, unaware of the world around them. They didn't deserve this. They didn't deserve to be erased from Lucien's life, to grow up with no knowledge of the man who had fathered them, who had promised to be there for them. Nalani had kept her promise to herself, to never let them feel abandoned. But how long could she protect them from the reality that loomed over them? The one man who could change their world, who could claim them as his own, had turned his back on them, not once but twice. Tears welled in her eyes as she hugged them close, but the fury inside her grew stronger. She wiped away the tears, staring at the screen, the image of Lucien and Elara smiling together, blissfully unaware of the wreckage they had left in their wake. She knew it was time. She couldn't keep running from the past, not for herself, and certainly not for her boys. They deserved the truth. She stood, carefully placing courage in his crib beside Truth, who was still peacefully asleep. Nalani's hands trembled as she took a deep breath. She wasn't angry at the woman he was marrying. Elara was nothing more than a part of his world that Nalani had never been able to fit into. No, the anger was reserved for Lucien, for the man who had taken her love, given her hope, and then crushed it beneath his arrogance and pride, for the man who had left her on the streets, carrying his children, with nothing but her will to survive. Nalani didn't need revenge. What she needed was answers. She needed him to look into her eyes and realize the consequences of his actions. She needed him to understand that there was more at stake than his self-indulgent lifestyle. There were lives here, lives that would be forever changed by his decisions. And so, with a resolute heart, She made her decision. She would go to the wedding, not to disrupt it, not to tear it down, but to confront him, to tell him that the past was not something he could bury beneath champagne and designer gowns, that the lives he had abandoned could no longer be ignored. She wasn't going to beg him to be a father, but she was going to show him the sons he had abandoned. He couldn't forget them if she was standing in front of him, showing him the proof of his choices. Nalani walked to the window of her apartment, gazing out at the city below. The skyline stretched out in front of her, full of promises and dreams. She had built a life from nothing, and she had no intention of letting Lucian's past actions define hers or her children's future. The rage that had consumed her in that moment shifted, becoming something more focused. She wasn't just going to face him for her sake, she was going to do it for courage and truth. She grabbed her purse, slung it over her shoulder, and took a deep breath, steadying herself. As she stepped out the door, she looked back one last time at her apartment, the place where she had fought for everything, where she had birthed her sons, and where she had promised them a better life. Today she would face Lucien. Today the past would finally catch up to him. Lucien Vale's wedding was a dream made real, a carefully constructed masterpiece, a symbol of his power, wealth, and the life he had built for himself. The venue was a grandiose ballroom with towering crystal chandeliers that glittered like stars above, casting a soft golden glow across the crowd. The floor was polished marble, reflecting the lavish decor and the endless sea of flowers that adorned every surface. Celebrities, business moguls, socialites, all of them had gathered in the space to witness the union of Lucien and Elara Caruso, two of the city's most influential figures. The bride was breathtaking. Elara wore a designer gown that looked like something out of a fairy tale, an ethereal creation of lace and satin that hugged her body, flowing into a long train that shimmered with every step she took. Her dark eyes sparkled with excitement and love as she stood at the altar, her smile radiant, knowing this was her moment. Lucien, ever the perfect groom, stood at her side, a look of complete satisfaction on his face. He was the epitome of confidence in his perfectly tailored tuxedo, the sharp lines of his suit a reflection of his life, pristine, controlled, and flawless. Everything about the wedding screamed perfection. It was the kind of event that would be talked about for months, maybe even years to come. The guests sipped champagne, the orchestra played soft music in the background, and the air was thick with anticipation. But in the midst of all this grandeur, there was a moment when everything came to a screeching halt. The doors to the ballroom swung open, and there, standing in the entrance, was Nalani. She wasn't dressed in the luxurious gown that would have fit the event's extravagant style. Instead, she wore something simple, a sleek, elegant dress that hugged her curves, modest but stunning. It was a dress she could afford, something that reflected her resilience, her strength, and the years she had spent clawing her way back from the depths of despair. In her hands were her two sons, Courage and Truth, their small fingers wrapped around hers as they stood by her side. Both boys were dressed in neat little outfits, looking both curious and confused as they gazed around the room. The sight of Nalani, along with her twin sons, stopped the entire room in its tracks. A heavy silence fell over the crowd. Conversations faltered, and the music came to an abrupt halt. For a moment, no one seemed to know what to do or say. All eyes were on Nalani, who stood poised in the doorway, a mother's quiet strength emanating from her as she surveyed the room. Her gaze shifted from the bewildered guests to the man standing at the altar, the man who had once promised her everything, who had once made her believe in a future that was now shattered. Lucien's expression went from one of cold composure to absolute shock. His blue eyes widened, and for a split second it was as though he had seen a ghost. His mouth opened slightly, as if to speak, but no words came. His pulse quickened, and a cold sweat broke out on his brow. "Nalani," he muttered under his breath, the name escaping his lips in a mixture of confusion and frustration. His body stiffened, as if he were physically trying to push the memory of her back into the past. "What are you doing here?" Lucien growled, his voice low and laced with irritation. He took a few steps toward her, his sharp jaw clenched, but he didn't move to approach her fully. His eyes darted to the guests, who were all now whispering among themselves, watching the unfolding scene with curiosity and disbelief. Ilara, standing beside Lucien, looked equally stunned. She quickly composed herself, a faint smile appearing on her lips, though it didn't reach her eyes. There was an edge to her voice as she addressed Nalani, though her words lacked any true warmth. "Lucien," Ilara said, turning to him, her voice tinged with a bit of confusion and the hint of a challenge. "Who is she? And why is she here?" Nalani didn't answer Ilara immediately. Instead, she stepped forward, her eyes locked on Lucien's. She didn't flinch under the weight of his gaze. She didn't flinch under the whispering crowd. This moment was for her sons, and for the truth that had been long buried. She raised her chin, her voice steady and clear, though every word she spoke seemed to reverberate through the room. "I'm not here to cause a scene, Lucien," Nalani said softly, though there was an undeniable strength in her tone. "I'm not here for revenge or to disrupt your perfect little world." She paused for a moment, her eyes scanning the faces in the room, the audience who was hanging on to her every word. "But you need to know that these two little boys," she said, her voice rising slightly, "are yours." She looked down at Courage and Truth, her hands gently resting on their heads. "These are your sons, Lucien." The room fell completely silent. The murmurs and gasps that followed echoed through the grand ballroom like a tidal wave. People exchanged stunned glances, some trying to process what they had just heard, others shaking their heads in disbelief. Lucien stood frozen. His jaw tightened as his eyes flicked between Nalani and the two boys, who were now staring up at him with wide, innocent eyes. He felt the weight of her words hit him like a blow to the chest, but he couldn't make sense of it. His mind raced, searching for an explanation, but nothing came. "You're lying," he finally managed, though there was no conviction in his words. The accusation was more of a desperate plea for this moment to be untrue, to somehow undo everything Nalani had just said. Nalani shook her head slowly, her eyes softening with an emotion that Lucien couldn't quite place. She stepped forward, her voice unwavering as she spoke directly to him. "You left me, Lucien. You blocked me. You turned your back on me and on these boys," Nalani said. "But they deserve to know you. They deserve more than what you've given them. Nothing." The sting of her words cut through the tension in the room, silencing any further questions or comments. Lucien's face twisted into a mixture of confusion, anger, and regret, though he refused to show any true vulnerability in front of the crowd. Nalani looked down at her sons, her heart swelling with love and pride. She would fight for them, no matter the cost. She wasn't going to let Lucien's arrogance or guilt erase the bond they had. "Take a good look at them, Lucien," she said, her voice breaking with emotion but still full of resolve. "These boys are your flesh and blood. They deserve the truth." Lucien's gaze flickered toward the children, but he quickly averted his eyes. His breath was shallow as his mind grappled with the reality of the situation. This wasn't just some angry confrontation. This was his past staring him in the face, and it was impossible to deny. The room was still hushed, waiting for his response. Ilara, standing by his side, looked at him with confusion, a faint unease creeping into her expression. She had not expected this. She had not expected the man she was about to marry to be confronted with such a shocking truth. Lucien's eyes shifted from Nalani to his sons, and back to Nalani, his thoughts a chaotic blur. For the first time, he felt something in him begin to unravel. His carefully constructed life, the one he had been so proud of, suddenly felt like a house of cards about to fall. But even as his world seemed to tip into chaos, the one thing he knew was that he could no longer turn away. The room remained eerily quiet, a heavy silence hanging like a thick fog. Lucien stood there, unmoving, his body tense, every muscle locked in place as Nalani's words continued to echo in his ears. The reality of the moment was too much for him to process at once. His mind swirled, racing in 1,000 directions, struggling to reconcile the man he had become with the truth that had just been dropped onto him like a ton of bricks. The guests, once vibrant and engaged in their own whispers, now seemed like mere spectators in a drama far beyond their understanding. Eyes darted between Lucien, Nalani, and the two small children by her side. Whispers grew louder, but no one dared break the stillness. Nalani's gaze never wavered from Lucien's, even as she noticed the ripple of discomfort spreading through the room. There was no need to beg for answers, no need to scream for recognition. She had already done the hardest part. She had carried the weight of their betrayal alone for so long. But now she would simply let the truth speak for itself. The boys were proof enough. They were his blood, his legacy, and they had every right to be acknowledged. Her heart beat with quiet fury, and her voice carried a weight of finality when she spoke again. But this time it wasn't for Lucien, it was for her children. She wasn't looking for an apology. She didn't want his guilt or his remorse. She simply wanted him to see them, to see his sons. "Do you see them, Lucien?" "These are your children," Nalani's voice rang out, unwavering but full of emotion. "These boys, the ones you abandoned without a second thought. This is what your decisions have cost. You can't just walk away from them, from what you've done. They are your flesh and blood, and they deserve more than just to be forgotten." Lucien remained silent, his face a mask of indifference, but inside a whirlwind of emotions had begun to churn. The storm inside him, the one he had long kept at bay, began to break free. He had spent years running from the consequences of his actions, burying them beneath a polished exterior of success, wealth, and fleeting relationships. But now, in the face of these children, his children, he could no longer deny the past. He could no longer ignore the truth. Nalani's eyes softened as she looked at courage and truth, her love for them shining through despite the bitterness of the situation. Courage, still holding his mother's hand, suddenly tugged at her sleeve, his little voice breaking the tense silence. "Daddy." The word hung in the air, soft yet powerful, innocent, pure. It was like a dagger piercing through Lucien's carefully constructed shell. At that moment, everything froze. The air became thick with disbelief, and the weight of what had just been said struck Lucien like a physical blow. His heart clenched, and for the first time, he truly saw them. His sons, standing before him with wide eyes, their faces open and trusting, searching for something from him. It wasn't anger in their eyes. It wasn't resentment. It was simply a quiet hope. They didn't know the years of pain that had led them here. They didn't know the bitterness their mother had endured. They only knew one thing. They had called him Daddy. Lucien's breath caught in his throat. A wave of guilt, regret, and disbelief swept over him in a rush. He hadn't even known they existed until now. He had pushed them from his mind, buried them under the lie that his life was better without the complications of a family. But now, standing in front of him, in all their innocence and purity, were the consequences of his choices. And in that single moment, everything he had built, everything he thought mattered, seemed irrelevant. The world around him blurred, the chatter of the guests fading into the background as the full weight of reality descended upon him. The sound of a chair scraping against the floor snapped him back to the present. Ilara, who had been standing frozen beside him, looked like she had just seen a ghost. Her face was pale, her lips pressed into a thin line. Without a word, she turned and fled from the room, her heels clicking sharply against the marble floor as she made her way to the exit, leaving behind the glittering promises of the life she had envisioned with Lucien. She couldn't bear the scene unfolding before her, the one where her soon-to-be husband was confronted with the consequences of his past actions. And more than that, she couldn't bear the reality that he was faced with the undeniable truth of the family he had abandoned. The whispers in the room grew louder as Ilara disappeared, but Lucien didn't hear them. He was still locked in the moment with Nalani and her children. The words he had once dismissed, words that had seemed like an unwanted burden, now felt like a sharp, unrelenting truth. "Daddy?" Courage asked again, his little voice trembling, his innocent gaze never leaving Lucien's face. The word hit Lucien like a thunderclap. It echoed in his mind, ricocheted through his memories. He remembered the nights he had spent with Nalani, the way she had looked at him, the promises he had made, and the way she had trusted him. He remembered her tears, the ones she had hidden from him when he had turned his back on her. But none of that mattered now. What mattered was that, in front of him, stood two little lives that he had created, two little souls who were asking for something he had never thought they would need from him: his love. A lump formed in his throat, and his chest tightened with a flood of emotions he couldn't contain. His jaw clenched, and his hand shook slightly as he reached out for Courage, who was still standing there, waiting. The boy didn't flinch, didn't pull away. He simply looked up at Lucien, his small hand still in his mother's grasp. Lucien knelt slowly, his knees touching the cold marble floor, his blue eyes meeting Courage's innocent gaze. "Daddy?" Courage repeated, his voice small but filled with longing. It was too much. The memories, the guilt, the weight of the years. In that moment, Lucien's defenses shattered. His heart cracked open and a single tear escaped down his cheek. He reached for Courage, pulling the child into his arms with a tenderness he had never known he possessed. The room fell completely silent. No one dared to speak, to breathe. They all watched as Lucien Vale, the cold, ruthless CEO, a man who had never been moved by anything, held his son for the first time. Tears welled up in Lucien's eyes as he hugged Courage tightly, a heavy sob escaping from deep within him. The years of self-imposed isolation, the arrogance, the mistakes, they all seemed so small now. Nothing mattered but this moment of connection with the children he had abandoned, who had been waiting for him all this time. Nalani stood there, her chest tight, her eyes watching him with a mixture of pain, sorrow, and something that almost resembled forgiveness. She knew it wasn't going to be easy. She knew Lucien couldn't undo the past. But she also knew that, in this moment, something had changed in him. And perhaps, just perhaps, there was a chance for redemption. The ballroom, once filled with the hum of luxury and expectation, was now still, as though time had slowed down in the wake of the confrontation. The dazzling chandeliers, the sparkling gowns, the gilded decor, all seemed irrelevant, faded into the background as Lucien knelt before his sons. His heart pounded in his chest, a frantic, unsteady rhythm. Courage and Truth, unaware of the heavy weight of history they were witnessing, continued to stand there, their innocent eyes wide with curiosity. They had only known one truth. They had a father. They had called to him, reaching out with a simple, untainted hope, their words floating in the air like a prayer. And now Lucien Vale, the man who had built his empire on power, wealth, and control, was no longer the invincible force he had once been. He was kneeling on the cold marble floor, vulnerable and broken. The tears that had threatened him moments before now poured freely from his eyes. He couldn't stop them, couldn't even try to hide the vulnerability that gripped him. He wrapped his arms around the two boys, his heart trembling as he pulled them close. The warmth of their small bodies, their sweet, untainted affection, was overwhelming. They didn't know the years of silence between them. They didn't know that he had abandoned them, had blocked them from his life as if they were nothing more than a fleeting memory. All they knew was that their daddy was here now. They clung to him, their tiny arms wrapping around him in a silent, trusting embrace. "Daddy," Courage whispered again, this time resting his head on Lucian's shoulder. Truth mirrored his brother's actions, nestling into Lucian's chest with a child's complete trust in the man who had never been there. Lucian closed his eyes, the weight of it all crashing down on him. The floodgates had opened, and the grief, the guilt, and the regret were impossible to contain. His heart felt as though it might burst from the sheer force of the emotions flooding through him. He was a father now, something he had never fully understood until this very moment. These boys were his flesh and blood, and they had been waiting for him, silently yearning for his presence, for his love, for the acknowledgement that they mattered. The world outside of this moment seemed distant, forgotten. Lucien had no care for the wedding, the guests, or even the life he had built up to this point. All he cared about now was these two boys, their soft breaths against his neck, the steady thump of their hearts that somehow mirrored his own in the stillness of the room. The future felt uncertain, but in that moment, everything was focused on the simple truth. He was their father. And that meant everything. Nalani, standing at the edge of the room, her arms crossed protectively over her chest, watched this powerful, fragile scene unfold before her. Her heart was heavy with emotion, tears threatening to spill from her own eyes. She had always known that Lucien had the potential for greatness. She had always believed that deep within him, beyond the arrogance and the coldness, was a man who could love, if only he allowed himself to. But this raw vulnerability, this breaking of the walls around his heart, it was something she hadn't expected. She knew Lucian's journey had just begun. The man kneeling before her was far from the one who had left her behind without a second thought. This man who held their sons so tightly was on the edge of something bigger. The question now was whether he would rise to meet it, or retreat back into the life he had carefully constructed for himself. Her gaze softened as she observed the tenderness in his actions, the way his hands gently caressed the backs of his sons, the way he buried his face in their hair as if he could hide from the world and find solace in them. After a long moment, Lucien looked up at Nalani, his face etched with the sorrow of the years he had lost, the years he had thrown away. His eyes, once cold and calculating, were now open, full of regret and something more. There was no hiding from the truth now, no pretending it wasn't there. "I was a coward," he whispered, the words so raw they seemed to tear at him from the inside. He swallowed hard, but the lump in his throat made it difficult to speak. "I see that now. I thought I was doing what was best for myself, but I was wrong. I ran away from you, from them, from everything that mattered. I thought I could outrun my mistakes. But now I know I can't. Not anymore." Nalani's heart clenched. There was no anger in her eyes as she gazed at him, only sorrow. And maybe, just maybe, a glimmer of hope. Hope that maybe Lucien could become the man she had once believed he could be. Hope that he could grow into the father his sons deserved. She stepped closer, her movements deliberate but slow, as if giving him the space to come to terms with the man he was becoming. She wasn't going to push him. She wasn't going to force him into something he wasn't ready for. "You don't have to run anymore," she said quietly, her voice steady and calm. "You can't undo the past, Lucien, but you can be here now, for them, and for yourself." Lucien nodded, his chest tightening with a mixture of pain and relief. "I've been running from everything, from you, from them, from myself," he admitted. "I was scared of being a father, scared of what it would mean for me. But now I understand. I understand everything." His eyes locked onto Nalani's, searching her face for a sign, some sign that she might be willing to give him a chance to make things right. to redeem himself in the eyes of the woman who had once loved him, and perhaps still could, in some quiet, secret corner of her heart. Nalani didn't answer immediately. She simply looked at him, her gaze soft but guarded. She knew that forgiveness wasn't something that could be given in a single moment. It wasn't something that could be handed over in a sweep of emotion. But she also knew that Lucian's words, though heavy with regret, were a start, a beginning. She could see the sincerity in his eyes, and for the first time in a long while she wondered if he might truly change. "You've taken the first step," she said finally, her voice full of quiet strength. "The rest will take time, but I'm willing to watch, Lucian. I'm willing to see if you can become the man you should have been, for them, for yourself." Lucian's heart swelled with emotion as he looked down at his sons, still nestled in his arms. They were his redemption, his second chance. "I'll do whatever it takes," he said, the promise deep and true in his voice. "For them, for you." And as he held courage and truth tighter, feeling the warmth of their small bodies against him, Lucian knew that the path ahead would be long and difficult. He had so much to atone for. But in this moment, surrounded by the innocent love of his children and the quiet understanding of Nalani, he had a chance, and for the first time, he believed in it. Lucian Vale's life, once a carefully curated empire of luxury, power, and control, had become something entirely different in the weeks that followed the wedding crash. Every corner of his existence had shifted, his priorities, his relationships, even his understanding of what it meant to be a man. It was as if the very foundation of his identity had been torn apart, exposing the raw vulnerability beneath and forcing him to build himself anew. The path to redemption wasn't easy. Lucian had never known a life outside of the cold, calculated world of business deals and high society, and he certainly had never imagined that his own shortcomings, his inability to care for his family, his tendency to run from responsibility, would haunt him in such a way. But now, with courage and truth in his life, there was no choice but to confront his past. The man he had been was no longer an option. He didn't expect forgiveness from Nalani, not immediately, and perhaps not ever. But what he could do was show her that he was willing to change, to prove through actions what he had once failed to demonstrate with words. If there was any chance, even the smallest sliver, of winning her back, of earning her trust again, it would be through the things he did, not the things he said. The first step was leaving behind the life that had defined him for so long, the life that had been so intricately woven with his success, his reputation, and his pride. Lucian took a step that few men with his stature would dare. He handed over the reins of his corporate empire, the sleek offices, the towering buildings, the hundreds of millions of dollars. He put them all aside. Lucien knew that power alone would never earn him redemption. He had spent years sitting at the top of his throne, looking down on the world. But that throne had never given him the fulfillment he sought. Instead, he took his fortune and made a different kind of investment. Millions of dollars were funneled into single-mother shelters, organizations that helped provide housing, health care, and education for women in need. Lucien wanted to make amends in the only way he knew how, by making a real, tangible difference in the lives of those who were most vulnerable. It wasn't about publicity or recognition. It wasn't about flaunting his wealth to prove something. It was simply the right thing to do. And in a way, it was part of his own healing, a way to atone for the pain he had caused Nalani and countless others by abandoning them. Each day, Lucian's world became quieter, simpler, and filled with more purpose. No longer did he attend gala after gala, rubbing elbows with the elite of society. Instead, he spent time with courage and truth, learning how to be a father. It was harder than he had imagined. Nothing in his life had prepared him for the small moments of fatherhood, the late-night feedings, the early morning cries, the endless questions. the need to constantly show up. But with each moment, Lucien found himself more and more drawn into their world of innocence, of love, of needs so simple but profound. He had to learn how to be present, how to listen, how to put aside his own fears and doubts long enough to truly connect with them. Every day he practiced. He was still learning how to be a father, still figuring out how to be there for them in ways that mattered. And though it was challenging, though it made him feel inadequate at times, Lucien could not deny the joy that came with these quiet moments. Holding his sons close, reading them stories at night, playing games in the park. All of it made him feel something he had never known before, a sense of purpose that extended beyond himself. He was needed. He mattered. Nalani watched cautiously at first as Lucien began to rebuild himself. She wasn't sure what she was looking for. Proof that he had changed, proof that he was truly trying, or simply proof that he was capable of something beyond the man he had been. The wound inside her was still fresh, still raw, and it would take time to heal. But what she saw in Lucien wasn't the man who had abandoned her, who had left her to face the world alone. It was a man trying, failing, and trying again. He was putting in the work, and though it wasn't easy to admit, Nalani couldn't ignore the slow but steady transformation she was witnessing. Her heart still ached for the days lost, for the dreams that had once been shattered. But she could no longer deny the man before her. Lucien was not the same man she had known. The arrogance, the flippancy that had defined him were gone. There was a humility in him now, a quiet, unspoken understanding that he had made mistakes. But he was willing to do the hard work to make things right. At first, Nalani kept her distance, emotionally and physically. She didn't want to give in too soon. She had been burned by his promises before, and she wasn't about to fall for the same tricks. But over time, she began to see small changes in him that spoke volumes. He listened now, really listened. He didn't just hear her words, he heard the spaces in between them. He asked questions about the boys' lives, about their needs, about her life and what she had experienced. There was no rushing her, no pushing her to forgive, only a quiet patience that gave her space to heal. One day, after spending a Saturday afternoon at the park with the boys, Nalani found herself sitting on a bench, her eyes focused on the small, playful figures of her children running in the grass. Lucien sat beside her, silently watching the same scene. But it wasn't awkward. There was no tension between them, just the natural rhythm of two people who had once loved each other and who had now found a new kind of connection. "Do you ever think about how different things could have been?" Nalani asked softly, her voice barely above a whisper, as if testing the waters of vulnerability. Lucien took a deep breath, his gaze not leaving the boys. "Every day. I think about it constantly. I think about how I could have been better, how I should have been better." Nalani nodded, her heart heavy with the weight of the truth in his words. "It wasn't just about you, Lucien. It was about the choices you made, the people you hurt." Her voice cracked slightly, but she steadied herself. "And now, we're all trying to figure out how to move forward." Lucien turned to her then, his eyes full of sincerity. "I don't expect you to forgive me right away. I don't expect it at all. But I need you to know that I will keep trying. Every day. For them. For you. I'll never stop." There was a long pause before Nalani spoke again, her voice soft but resolute. "I see you, Lucien. I see the man you're becoming. And that's all I can ask for." For the first time in a long while, Nalani allowed herself to breathe a little easier. She wasn't ready to put all of her trust in him again. Not yet. But she could see that he was trying, truly trying, and that meant something. It meant everything. A year had passed since that fateful day in the ballroom, the day when Lucien Vale, the powerful CEO, had come face to face with the reality of his mistakes. The journey since then had been one of patience, self-reflection, and, most of all, growth. The man who once ruled his empire from a place of arrogance and ruthless ambition was now standing at the threshold of something far greater than wealth or power. He was standing at the edge of a new beginning, a life defined not by what he could take, but by what he could give. The small coastal town had been Nalani's choice. She had always loved the simplicity of the sea, the way the waves, constant and unchanging, reminded her that no matter how much time passed, there was always a way back to what was real. It was fitting, she thought, that the place where she had learned to heal would now be the place where she took her next step. A new chapter, a new life. Lucien stood at the altar beneath a canopy of wildflowers. The gentle breeze tugged at his suit, and the sun bathed everything in a soft golden light. His eyes, once cold and distant, now held a warmth that had been born from the fire of his own redemption. In the distance, the ocean roared, timeless and eternal, a reflection of the journey that had brought him here today. His heart was pounding in his chest as he waited for her. For Nalani, the guests were few in number, but every one of them had been a part of Lucien's transformation. There was no opulence here, no grandiose spectacle, just the people who mattered, Nalani's closest friends, his closest family, and, most importantly, courage and truth, who had come to understand the true meaning of family in a way few children ever would. They were standing at the front, holding Nalani's train with the pride of sons who had finally found their father. Lucien's eyes wandered over the small gathering, taking in the scene. There was no crowd of photographers snapping endless pictures, no cameras broadcasting this moment to the world. This was theirs. This was personal. This was real. Then the music changed, and all eyes turned to the path leading toward the altar. Nalani appeared, her golden dress shimmering in the sunlight. The fabric caught the breeze, flowing with a grace that matched the rhythm of her steps. Her braided hair, now loosely pinned with delicate flowers, framed her face in a way that made her look both timeless and otherworldly. She had always been beautiful to him, but today, in this moment, she was more than that. She was a woman who had overcome so much, a woman who had given him the chance to prove himself, and one who had taught him the meaning of love, forgiveness, and family. Her sons walked beside her, tiny and proud, their small hands gripping the fabric of her gown as if it were the most precious thing in the world. Lucien watched them carefully, unable to hide the emotion that swelled in his chest as he realized how far he had come, from the man who had turned his back on them to the man who was now standing here, waiting for her, for them, for the life they would now build together. Nalani reached the altar, and when she looked up at him, the years of pain, fear, and heartache that had once been between them seemed to vanish. There was nothing left but the shared understanding of the journey they had traveled, together and apart. The silence between them spoke volumes, as if the world had held its breath, waiting for this moment. Lucien took her hands in his voice barely a whisper. "I don't deserve you, Nalani, but I will spend every day of my life proving that I'm worthy of the love you've given me." Nalani's eyes glistened with tears, but she smiled softly. There was no anger left in her heart, no fear, just the deep, unshakable love she had for him, one that had blossomed despite all the darkness of their past. "You've already proven it," she said, her voice steady. "You've already shown me the man you've become." The officiant spoke, but Lucien barely heard the words. Everything around him blurred, and all that mattered was the woman before him, the children by his side, and the life they would now share. In that moment, there was no past, no regrets, only this future, this chance. And when the officiant finally declared, "You may kiss your bride," it wasn't with a sense of obligation or guilt. It was with love. A love that had been forged in pain, in mistakes, and in the difficult, tender moments of redemption. It was a love that had survived the test of time, of betrayal, and of the deepest wounds. Lucien leaned down, his hand gently cupping Nalani's face, and kissed her. It was a kiss that spoke of everything they had been through, the tears, the loss, the silence, and everything they would become. It was a kiss of healing, of forgiveness, and of hope. When they pulled away, there was no need for words. The joy in their eyes, the way their hands remained intertwined, was enough to say everything that needed to be said. The guests cheered softly, but it felt as though the world itself had paused, holding its breath for just a little longer. Lucien and Nalani stood together, as husband and wife, a family. As they turned to walk down the aisle, the sunlight bathed them in warmth, the sound of the ocean echoing in the background. Courage and truth skipped ahead, laughing as they ran hand in hand, their innocent voices filling the air with lightness. Nalani and Lucien followed, side by side, the world before them wide open, filled with endless possibilities. They were no longer strangers from different worlds. They were a family, bound not by blood alone, but by the shared journey of growth, healing, and the unwavering bond of love. And as they stepped into the future together, the past, though still a part of them, no longer defined them. They had forged their own path, one that was theirs to walk, hand in hand, with their sons by their side. The wedding of truth, the wedding of love, had come to an end, but their journey, one of hope, of second chances, and of redemption, was just beginning.